They say behind every great man is a great woman. But in the case of billionaire tech mogul Richard Sterling, that woman was standing in his shadow holding a serving tray when Richard strutted into the High Court of New York, clutching the hand of his 23-year-old mistress. He thought the divorce was just a business transaction. He thought he could write a check and erase 20 years of marriage. He was wrong. He didn't realize that the quiet woman sitting at the defendant's table, the former waitress he mocked for being simple, didn't just hold the memories of his past. She held the deed to his entire future. This is the story of how arrogance lost an empire. The heavy oak doors of Courtroom 4B swung open with a theatrical flair that seemed reserved for movie sets, not the grim reality of the New York family court. But Richard Sterling never did anything without an audience. Richard, the CEO of Aerodyne Systems, a company currently valued at $4 billion on the NASDAQ, walked in, looking like he owned the building. He was wearing a bespoke Brioni suit, charcoal grey, cut to accentuate the shoulders he claimed carried the weight of the tech industry. On his wrist sat a Patek Philippe watch, worth more than the average American home. But it wasn't the watch or the suit that caused the gallery to gasp. It was the woman on his arm. Veronica Blair. She was stunning undeniably, but entirely out of place. She wore a crimson dress that was too tight, too short, and too loud for a divorce hearing. She clung to Richard's bicep chewing gum with a rhythmic snap that echoed in the sudden silence of the room. She was an Instagram model with 2 million followers and a reputation for wrecking homes, and today she looked at the woman sitting at the defendant's table with a smirk of pure victory. "Sit down, Richard," his lawyer Arthur P. Harrington hissed. Harrington was the kind of lawyer who charged $1,500 an hour and had a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And for God's sake, tell Veronica to stop chewing like a cow." Richard laughed, a booming, confident sound. "Relax, Arthur. This will be over by lunch. We're just here to trim the fat." Across the aisle, sitting alone at a table that looked too big for her, was Amelia Sterling. Amelia didn't look like a billionaire's wife. She wore a navy blue blazer that was at least 3 seasons old and sensible flats. Her hair, once a vibrant blonde, was pulled back into a severe bun, revealing the fine lines of a woman who had spent 2 decades worrying about things Richard couldn't be bothered with. She didn't look up as her husband and his mistress took their seats. She kept her eyes focused on a stack of manicured files in front of her. Her lawyer, a man named Tobias Finch, looked like he had slept in his car. His tie was crooked, and he was shuffling papers nervously. Compared to the shark-like Harrington Finch, looked like a minnow about to be swallowed whole. "All rise!" the bailiff bellowed. Judge Harrison entered. She was a woman in her 60s with steel-grey hair and eyes that had seen every variation of human greed imaginable. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and looked down at the docket. Then she looked at Richard, then at Veronica. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Harrison said, her voice dry, "I see you've brought moral support." "My fiancée, Your Honor," Richard said smoothly, not even bothering to stand up until Harrington nudged him. "Veronica is here because she represents my future. Amelia is just the past." Amelia flinched. It was a small movement, barely a tremor, but Tobias saw it. He placed a hand gently on her arm. "Steady, Amelia," he whispered. "Let him talk. The more he talks, the deeper he digs." "This is a petition for divorce and division of assets," Judge Harrison noted, ignoring Richard's jab. "Miss Sterling, you are petitioning to enforce a separation of assets that leaves Mrs. Sterling with—" The judge squinted at the paper, as if she couldn't believe what she was reading. A monthly stipend of $5,000 and the retention of a 2016 Honda Civic. Is this a joke? Harrington stood up, smoothing his tie. Your Honor, my client built Aerodyne from the ground up. He is the visionary. He is the face of the brand. Mrs. Sterling has not been employed since 1998. She has contributed zero capital to the corporation. The offer is generous, considering her lack of contribution. Lack of contribution. The voice was soft, but it carried across the room. Amelia Sterling stood up. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was clear. I'm sorry, Your Honor, Amelia said, but I think Mr. Sterling has a selective memory. Richard rolled his eyes, leaning over to whisper something into Veronica's ear that made her giggle. The sound grated on the nerves of everyone in the room. Mrs. Sterling, speak through your counsel, the judge warned gently. It's okay, Tobias, Amelia said to her lawyer. She looked directly at Richard. He wants to talk about vision. He wants to talk about who built what. Then let's talk about the Bluebird diner. Richard's face went rigid. The smirk vanished. Objection, Harrington shouted. Relevance. We are here to discuss current assets, not ancient history. Overruled, Judge Harrison said, leaning forward. She loved ancient history, especially when it made arrogant men sweat. I want to hear about this Bluebird diner. Proceed, Mrs. Sterling. The courtroom seemed to dissolve as Amelia began to speak. She wasn't painting a picture of a boardroom or a stock exchange. She was taking them back to a rainy Tuesday in Seattle 22 years ago. I was 21. Amelia began, her voice gaining strength. I was working double shifts at the Bluebird diner off I-5. My feet bled every night. I smelled like grease and stale coffee. And every night at 11:00 p.m., a young man would come in and order a cup of hot water and a side of toast, because that was the cheapest thing on the menu. She pointed a finger at Richard. That was him. Richard Sterling. He wasn't wearing brioni then. He was wearing a hoodie with holes in the elbows. He had been kicked out of his apartment. He was showering at the YMCA. He told me he was a genius, that he was working on an aerodynamic algorithm that would change the drone industry. But nobody would listen to him because he looked like a bum. Richard shifted in his seat. Veronica looked bored, scrolling on her phone under the table. I listened, Amelia continued. I sat with him until 3:00 a.m. every night. I gave him free refills. I brought him leftovers so he wouldn't starve. And when his laptop broke, the one with all his visionary code on it, who paid for the repair? This is touching, Harrington interrupted. But buying a man a sandwich hardly entitles you to half of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. I didn't just buy him a sandwich, Amelia snapped. The fire in her eyes surprised even Richard. 3 months into our friendship, Richard got a meeting with a venture capitalist. But he needed to incorporate. He needed to file a patent. He needed $5,000 for the legal fees and the initial prototype mold. He had zero. Amelia turned to her lawyer, Tobias. Exhibit A, please. Tobias shuffled his papers and produced a yellowed, crinkled piece of paper encased in a protective plastic sleeve. He handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. What is this? Judge Harrison asked. That, Amelia said, is a withdrawal slip from my savings account, dated November the 14th, 1999. It was my entire life savings. Every tip I had saved for 3 years to go to nursing school. I gave it to Richard. It was a loan, Richard shouted, breaking his silence. I paid you back. I bought you that house in the Hamptons. You didn't buy me a house, Richard. The company bought a corporate retreat that you allowed me to live in. Amelia corrected him sharply. But let's look at the document attached to that withdrawal slip. Exhibit B. Tobias handed over another document. It was a napkin, a greasy, stained diner napkin. Judge Harrison held it up to the light. On it, written in blue ballpoint pen, were scribbled lines of text. "Read the text, please, Your Honor," Amelia requested. Judge Harrison cleared her throat. "I, Richard Sterling, hereby acknowledge that Amelia Vance, soon to be Sterling, is the sole investor in the startup venture currently known as Project Skyward. In exchange for her capital and her faith, she is designated as the..." The judge paused, squinting at the messy handwriting. Richard was sweating now. He whispered frantically to Harrington, "That's not legal. That's a napkin. It's not notarized. It doesn't need to be notarized to be a binding contract in the state of Washington, if the intent is clear." Judge Harrison said, her eyes narrowing. "It says here, she is designated as the primary partner." "Partner?" Richard scoffed, standing up again. "Partner means wife, it means helper. It doesn't mean shareholder." "Actually," Tobias Finch spoke up for the first time, his voice surprisingly deep and resonant. "In the context of business law, partner has a very specific meaning, Mr. Sterling, especially when money changes hands." "This is ridiculous," Veronica piped up, her high-pitched voice cutting through the tension. "Richard, tell them to stop. My reservations are for 100 p.m. "Shut up, Veronica," Richard snapped. The courtroom went silent. The veneer of the perfect couple cracked instantly. Amelia looked at the woman with pity. "He spoke to me that way too, eventually," she said softly. "At first I was his savior. Then I was his wife. Then as the company got bigger, I became an embarrassment. I didn't have the right degrees. I didn't dress the right way. So he hid me away. He told the world he was a self-made man." She took a deep breath. "But we aren't here to discuss his ego. We are here to discuss Aerodyne. You see, Richard thinks he incorporated the company in Delaware in 2001. That's what his bio says on Wikipedia." Arthur Harrington looked at his client. "Richard, is that true?" "Yes, of course," Richard stammered. 2001. Delaware, standard procedure." "That's interesting," Tobias Finch said, walking toward the center of the room. He looked less like a confused public defender now, and more like a hunter closing a trap. "Because we did a little digging into the state archives of Washington, and it turns out the original LLC for Project Skyward, which holds the foundational patents for every piece of technology Aerodyne uses today, was never dissolved." Richard's face went pale, ghost white. "And," Tobias continued, holding up a sleek blue folder according to the filing from 1999, which Richard signed to get that $5,000 from the waitress he was courting, "there is a very specific breakdown of shares." "Objection!" Harrington screamed. "Surprise evidence!" "It's public record, Counselor," Judge Harrison said, leaning over the bench, her eyes gleaming. "Overruled. Mr. Finch, what does the filing say?" Tobias opened the folder. The silence in the room was so heavy, it felt like it could crush bones. "It says that Richard Sterling owns 49% of the voting shares." "And the other 51%? the judge asked. Tobias looked at Amelia, who was sitting with her back straighter than she had in years. "The controlling majority," Tobias said, a small smile playing on his lips, "belongs to the founding investor, Amelia Sterling." The silence that followed Tobias Finch's declaration was not the peaceful silence of a library. It was the suffocating vacuum of a bomb shelter, right after the blast doors have sealed. Richard Sterling, a man who had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions while sipping espresso in Tokyo, and fired 300 employees via a Zoom call without blinking, looked as though he had forgotten how to breathe. His mouth opened, then closed, resembling a fish pulled violently from the water. 51%, Judge Harrison repeated, her voice cutting through the stupor. She wasn't looking at the lawyers. She was looking at the documents in the blue folder, with the scrutiny of a jeweler inspecting a diamond for flaws. Miss Harrington, were you aware of this entity? Project Skyward, LLC. Arthur Harrington was already furiously typing on his tablet, his knuckles white. The shark-like composure was gone, replaced by the frantic energy of a man trying to stop a dam from bursting with nothing but chewing gum. Your Honor, this is an ancient filing, Harrington stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. It's a dormant entity. It has no bearing on Aerodyne Systems. Aerodyne was incorporated in Delaware. It is a separate legal person. Is it? Tobias Finch asked. He didn't shout. He didn't strut. He merely stood by his table, hands clasped behind his back, looking like a disappointed schoolteacher. Because, according to the Patent Office, the proprietary rotor stabilization technology, the very technology that makes Aerodyne drones the market leader, is not owned by Aerodyne. Tobias paused for effect, letting the words hang in the air. It is licensed to Aerodyne. Tobias continued, his voice dropping an octave, from the patent holder. And the patent holder is Project Skyward. Recess! Harrington shrieked, practically jumping out of his chair. Your Honor, we request an immediate recess to review this ambush. We need to authenticate these documents. Judge Harrison lowered her glasses. She looked at Amelia, who sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. Then she looked at Richard, whose face was rapidly turning a dangerous shade of purple. 30 minutes, Judge Harrison ruled, banging her gavel. And Mr. Sterling, do not leave the building. The moment the bailiff called all rise, chaos erupted. Richard turned on his heel, grabbing Harrington by the arm and dragging him toward the private consultation rooms at the back of the courthouse. Veronica. Blair, looking confused, and suddenly very small in her bright crimson dress, trotted after them, her high heels clicking frantically on the marble floor. Richard! Richard! Wait, she cried out. What does 51% mean, Richard? He ignored her, shoving through the door of the consultation room and slamming it shut, leaving her in the hallway. Veronica stood there blinking, the smell of expensive perfume and desperation lingering in the air. She looked around, realizing the paparazzi were outside. But inside, she was alone. Inside the small, windowless room, Richard slammed his fist onto the metal table. "Fix this, Arthur," he roared. "You told me she was handled. You told me she was a simpleton who would take the car and the monthly allowance and go cry in her mother's basement. You didn't tell me she had the damn LLC papers." Harrington threw his briefcase onto a chair and loosened his tie. "I didn't know, Richard. You told me you started the company. You never mentioned a partnership agreement from 1999. Do you know what this means? If that LLC is the parent holder of the IP, she doesn't just get half your money. She controls the board. She controls everything." Richard paced the room, his hands shaking. He walked to the water cooler, filled a paper cup, and crushed it in his hand without drinking. "It's a napkin," Richard hissed. "It's a napkin and a 20-year-old filing. I can argue I was under duress. I can argue she manipulated me. She was a waitress, for God's sake. No jury will believe a waitress invented the algorithm." "It's not about who invented it, you arrogant fool," Harrington snapped, losing his professional veneer. "It's about who paid for the patent. In Washington state, community property laws are strict, but contract law is stricter. If she put up the capital, and you signed that paper designating her as the majority partner, she owns the seed. And the seed grew the tree. Then destroy the tree, Richard set his eyes wild. I'll dissolve Aerodyne. I'll move the assets to the Caymans. I'll burn the whole thing down before I let that woman tell me what to do. You can't, Harrington said coldly. We are in the middle of a discovery phase. If you move a single cent now, you'll go to federal prison for fraud. And frankly, Richard, I'm not going with you. The door creaked open. It was Veronica. She slipped inside, looking less like a confident mistress and more like a rat sensing a sinking ship. Richard, she asked softly, does she really own the company? Richard spun around, his eyes blazing with misplaced rage. Get out, Veronica. Can't you see I'm dealing with business? But my credit card was declined at the coffee shop downstairs, she said, her voice rising in a whine. You said the limits were uncapped. Richard stared at her. For the first time, he didn't see the trophy he liked to parade around at galas. He saw a liability, a drain, a headache. I don't care about your coffee, Richard screamed. I'm about to lose $4 billion, and you're worried about a latte. Veronica recoiled, her face hardening. She wasn't a genius, but she had a survival instinct honed by years of navigating wealthy, insecure men. She saw the fear in Richard's eyes. She realized the power dynamic had just shifted. Don't yell at me, Richard, she warned, her tone shifting from whining to icy. I'm the only one standing by you. Everyone else is laughing. You looked like an idiot out there. Meanwhile, on the other side of the corridor, the atmosphere was entirely different. Amelia sat on a wooden bench, sipping lukewarm water from a plastic bottle. Tobias Finch sat beside her, checking his notes. He didn't look triumphant. He looked tired. Are you okay? Tobias asked gently. Amelia looked at her hands. They were rougher than Veronica's. They had scars from hot plates and knife slips. I don't want his money, Tobias. I never did. I just wanted him to remember. Remember what? That we were a team, she whispered. That I wasn't just some accessory he picked up. I was the one who held the flashlight while he fixed the wiring. I was the one who believed in Project Skyward when his own father told him to get a real job. She took a deep breath. He called me simple in his deposition. Amelia said, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. He said I lacked the intellectual capacity to understand his business. But he forgot that I did the bookkeeping for the first 5 years. I know where the bodies are buried, Tobias, and I know why he kept Project Skyward alive. Tobias looked at her intrigued. Why we assumed it was just negligence, that he forgot to dissolve the old entity. Amelia shook her head slowly. A sad, knowing smile touched her lips. Richard never forgets anything that saves him money, she said. He kept Project Skyward because of the tax loophole for small businesses in Washington. He funneled the royalties through it to avoid the corporate tax rate in Delaware. He used our old company, my company, as a tax haven. Tobias's eyes widened. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling through a PDF. If that's true, if he used the LLC for tax avoidance while claiming it didn't exist in the divorce proceedings, then he's not just a bad husband, Amelia finished. He's a felon. When the bailiff called the court back to order, the atmosphere had thickened. It was heavy, humid with tension. The gallery was full now. Word had spread. Reporters were texting furiously in the back row. Richard Sterling walked back to his table, but the strut was gone. He walked with a stiffness that suggested he was holding himself together with sheer willpower. Veronica sat behind him, arms crossed, staring at the back of his head with a look that could curdle milk. Judge Harrison looked down from the bench. "Mr. Harrington, are you ready to proceed?" Harrington stood up. He looked exhausted. "Your Honor, we argue that Project Skyward LLC was effectively abandoned. The plaintiff, Mrs. Sterling, has had no involvement in the company's operations for 20 years. The doctrine of large supplies. She sat on her rights. She cannot suddenly claim ownership after my client built the empire. It was a standard defense. You waited too long." "Interesting argument," Judge Harrison mused. "Mr. Finch." Tobias stood up. He walked to the center of the room carrying a single piece of paper. He moved slowly, deliberately. "Your Honor, the doctrine of laches requires that the plaintiff knew about the infringement of her rights and did nothing," Tobias said. "But Mrs. Sterling did not know she was being excluded. In fact, she was led to believe she was still a partner." Tobias turned to Richard. "Miss Sterling," Tobias said, "did you or did you not have your wife sign an annual document every April for the last 15 years? Richard blinked. He looked at Harrington, who shrugged helplessly. I have my wife sign many things. Household accounts, insurance. I'm referring to the spousal consent forms for tax filing," Tobias said. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor." Richard kept Project Skyward active to utilize a specific tax bracket. But to keep that bracket he needed to show that the LLC was family-held. Every year, he brought a document to Amelia, usually amidst a stack of other papers, and told her it was just for the accountant. Exhibit C. Tobias placed a stack of papers on the bench. "These are tax returns from 2005 through 2023. On every single one, Richard Sterling lists Amelia Sterling as a silent partner to qualify for the deduction. He didn't exclude her, Your Honor. He used her. He used her name to save millions in taxes, all while telling her she owned nothing." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. "This is entrapment," Richard blurted out, standing up. "She didn't read them. She just signed where I told her to." The courtroom gasped. Even Veronica looked shocked at the admission. Judge Harrison slowly took off her glasses. Her eyes were like ice. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Did you just admit on the record that you coerced your wife into signing legal tax documents she didn't understand solely for your financial benefit?" Richard froze. He realized too late that he had walked right into the trap. I meant she trusted me." Richard backpedaled, his voice cracking. "I handled the finances. That was our arrangement." "And in that arrangement," Amelia spoke up from her table, "she didn't stand this time. She sat firmly, her voice grounding the room. You told me that Project Skyward was our retirement fund. You told me it was a little savings account. You never told me it owned the patents to the drones." She looked at him with a devastating mix of sorrow and clarity. "I trusted you, Richard. I signed those papers because I thought we were building a life. I didn't know I was helping you build a getaway car." "The defense of laches is denied," Judge Harrison ruled instantly. "Mr. Sterling, by your own tax filings, you have acknowledged Mrs. Sterling's partnership status every year for 2 decades. You cannot claim she abandoned the company while you were using her name to shelter your profits." "This brings us to the valuation," Tobias said, pressing the advantage. "Since Project Skyward owns the IP and Aerodyne essentially rents that IP, we need to determine the licensing fee. Typically, the patent holder would demand significant royalties. Royalties that Aerodyne has never paid." Tobias turned to the gallery, then back to the judge. "We are not just asking for half of Richard's savings, Your Honor. We are asserting that Aerodyne Systems owes Project Skyward backdated royalties for 20 years of patent usage. By our forensic accountant's estimation. Tobias paused. Richard was gripping the table so hard his knuckles were blue. Aerodyne owes Project Skyward approximately $1.2 billion in unpaid licensing fees. And since Amelia owns 51% of Skyward, she owns the debt, Harrington whispered, horrified. Exactly. Tobias smiled. She doesn't just get a settlement. She is Aerodyne's largest creditor. She could bankrupt the company tomorrow if she called in the debt. Richard slumped into his chair. The air seemed to leave his body. The billionaire strut was a distant memory. He looked like a man who had just realized his parachute was filled with silverware. I built it, Richard whispered, his voice trembling. I built it all. On a foundation you borrowed from her, Judge Harrison corrected. Then a movement from the back of the courtroom caught everyone's attention. A man in a dark suit entered. He wasn't a lawyer. He wore the distinct lapel pin of a federal agency. He walked gallantly to the bailiff and whispered something. The bailiff nodded and approached the bench, handing Judge Harrison a note. The judge read it, her eyebrows raising. It seems, Mr. Sterling, Judge Harrison said, that your tax filings have attracted the attention of more than just this divorce court. The IRS has just sent a representative to observe the proceedings regarding the legitimacy of your silent partner. Deductions. Richard looked at the door. The man in the dark suit gave him a polite, predatory nod. Veronica Blair stood up. The sound of her chair scraping against the floor was loud in the silence. I'm leaving, she announced. Veronica, sit down, Richard hissed. No, she said loud enough for the microphone to catch. I signed a prenup for the engagement, Richard, but it said I get a settlement if you lie about your net worth. You don't have $4 billion. You have a massive debt to your wife and a tax fraud case. She grabbed her Chanel bag. I'm not going to prison for being your accessory, she spat, and I'm certainly not dating a broke man. She turned and walked out, her heels clicking a rhythm of abandonment. Richard watched her go, then slowly turned his head to look at Amelia. Amelia wasn't smiling. She wasn't gloating. She was looking at him with the same expression she used to have at the diner, when he would spill coffee on his shirt, a look of patient, weary disappointment. We take a recess for lunch, Judge Harrison announced. Mr. Sterling, I suggest you use this hour to consider a settlement offer, a real one. Because if we come back and I have to issue a ruling, you will leave this courtroom with nothing but the suit on your back. And frankly, given the tax fraud implications, you might not be keeping the suit. The settlement conference room was a windowless box designed to suck the soul out of its occupants. The walls were a neutral, non-threatening beige, the table a scuffed laminate that had absorbed the sweat of 1,000 failed marriages. Richard Sterling sat on one side, his head in his hands. The Brioni suit jacket was draped over the back of his chair, looking like a shed skin. His tie was undone, hanging loosely around his neck, like a noose he had forgotten to tighten. For the first time in 20 years, Richard looked his age. The boyish charm he used for magazine covers had dissolved, leaving behind a 45-year-old man who was terrified. Arthur Harrington sat beside him furiously, tapping on a calculator, muttering about mitigation strategies and deferred prosecution agreements. On the other side sat Amelia. She hadn't changed. She was still wearing the navy blazer and the sensible flats. She had a cup of lukewarm vending machine coffee in front of her, holding it with both hands as if to warm them. She looked calm, but inside a storm was settling. She wasn't angry anymore. She was just clear. Here is the reality, Richard, Tobias Finch said. His voice was low, lacking the theatricality of the courtroom. In this small room, he sounded like a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. You are facing 3 fronts. 1, the divorce court, which is ready to hand Amelia half your liquid assets. 2, the civil suit regarding the project Skyward royalties, which bankrupts Aerodyne. 3, the IRS audit, which likely ends with you in a federal facility. Richard looked up. His eyes were bloodshot. I can't go to jail, he whispered. I'm Richard Sterling. I can't go to jail, Amy. He used the nickname. Amy. He hadn't called her that since the diner days, since before the money, before the models, before the ego. Amelia's fingers tightened slightly around the paper cup. Don't, she said softly. Amy, please. Richard leaned forward, reaching across the table. Tobias moved to intercept, but Amelia held up a hand. Look, I messed up. I know I did. The fame, it got to me. But we built this together, remember. You said it yourself. You held the flashlight. We can fix this. We can make a deal. I'll give you $50 million. Cash. You can go anywhere. Paris, Rome. You always wanted to see Rome. Amelia looked at his hand, manicured and trembling, hovering over the table. 50 million, she repeated, out of 4 billion. It's a lot of money, Harrington interjected. More than you could spend in a lifetime, Mrs. Sterling. It's a generous offer to avoid destroying the company. You still don't get it, Amelia said, her voice steady. You think this is about the money. You think if you write a big enough check, I'll go back to being the invisible wife. She set the coffee cup down. The sound was a soft thud in the silence. I don't want your money, Richard. I want my company back. Richard recoiled as if slapped. Your company, I built Aerodyne. I did the interviews, I launched the products. You were at home. I was at home raising your children while you were launching products with your assistants. Amelia's voice rose, sharp and cutting. I was at home managing the accounts you were too arrogant to look at, and I was the one who legally owns the technology that makes your drones fly. Without Project Skyward, Richard Aerodyne is just a marketing firm selling paperweights. Tobias slid a document across the table. It wasn't a settlement check. It was a restructuring agreement. This is the deal, Tobias said. Amelia will not dissolve Project Skyward. She will not call in the $1.2 billion debt immediately. She will grant Aerodyne a stay of execution. Richard exhaled a sound of pure relief. Okay, good. Thank you. Good. I knew you were reasonable. However, Tobias continued, his eyes hard. In exchange for not destroying the company today, Amelia requires full recognition of her 51% controlling stake in the parent entity, which means she effectively controls the board of directors of Aerodyne. What does that mean? Richard asked, his relief turning to suspicion. It means, Amelia said, locking eyes with him, that I am the chairman of the board. It means I have veto power over all executive decisions. And it means, Richard, that you work for me. The room went dead silent. The hum of the air conditioner seemed to roar. I can't work for you, Richard stammered. I'm the CEO. I'm the face of the company. For now, Amelia said. You will keep your title. You will keep your office. Because if you leave, the stock crashes, and I don't want to hurt the employees. But you will have no signing authority over $5,000 without my countersignature. You will not fire anyone without my approval. And you will never ever lie to the press again. And the IRS? Harrington asked, looking at the document. What about the fraud investigation? If Richard signs this, Tobias said, pointing to a clause at the bottom, He admits to clerical errors in past filings and agrees to pay all back taxes and penalties personally. Amelia will frame the partnership as a silent arrangement that has now gone public. It might keep him out of prison, provided he pays every cent the IRS demands. "That will wipe me out," Richard said, horrified. "The penalties, the back taxes, I'll be left with nothing but my salary." "You'll have your freedom," Amelia said, "and you'll have a job, which is more than you were going to leave me with." Richard looked at the document. It was a surrender. It was the end of his reign as the unchecked king of tech. He looked at Harrington, but the lawyer just stared at the floor, knowing there was no other play. The napkin, the tax returns, the debt. It was an ironclad trap. Richard picked up the pen. His hand shook so badly the tip tapped against the paper, leaving little ink dots. "I hate you," Richard whispered, not looking at her. "I know," Amelia replied, her voice filled with a terrible sadness. "I loved you enough to save you when you were nothing. You hated me enough to try to destroy me when you became everything. Sign the paper, Richard." He signed. The headquarters of Aerodyne Systems was a fortress of glass and steel in downtown Manhattan. The boardroom, located on the 40th floor, was known as the Sky Deck. It offered a panoramic view of the city, a visual metaphor for the company's dominance. Usually the atmosphere in the Sky Deck was one of hushed reverence for Richard Sterling. Today, it smelled of fear. The board of directors had gathered in an emergency session. 12 men and women in suits that cost more than most cars sat around the 30-foot mahogany table. They were whispering, checking their phones, watching the stock price ticker that was currently glowing a frantic red. Rumors from the courthouse had leaked. Hostile takeover, secret partner, tax fraud. "We need to oust him," said Marcus Thorne, the CFO. He was a man who sweated easily, and he was currently dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. "If the IRS is involved, the stock is toxic. We need to cut Richard loose immediately." "And replace him with who?" asked Elena Corvez, the VP of Operations. "The public loves him. If we fire him without a successor, the stock tanks anyway. We are trapped." The double doors at the end of the room flew open. The room went silent. They expected Richard. They expected him to storm in, shouting orders, spinning the narrative using his charisma to bend reality. Instead, Richard walked in slowly. He looked tired. He had changed his tie, but his eyes were dull. He walked to the head of the table, pulled out his chair, and stood behind it. And he didn't sit. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard said, his voice raspy, "thank you for coming on such short notice." He looked around the room. These were people he had bullied, charmed, and manipulated for years. Now they looked at him like a wounded animal they were ready to put down. "There have been developments," Richard continued, "regarding the ownership structure of Aerodyne." "We heard," Marcus Thorne snapped. "Is it true, Richard? Does your wife hold a controlling interest in the IP? Because if she does, we are legally obligated to disclose this to the SEC immediately." Richard opened his mouth to speak, but a voice from the doorway interrupted him. "She does." The board members turned in unison. Amelia Sterling stood in the doorway. She wasn't wearing the navy blazer anymore. In the hour between the settlement and the meeting, Tobias had taken her to a boutique. She wore a tailored white suit, sharp and modern. It was armor. Her hair was no longer in a severe bun, but loose, framing a face that was pale but determined. She walked into the room. The sound of her heels on the polished concrete floor was rhythmic, deliberate. She didn't look at the floor. She looked at the faces of the people who had ignored her at company Christmas parties for a decade. "Who is—" Elena started, then stopped. She recognized the woman. It was the wife, the one they whispered about, the one Richard left at home. Amelia walked past the stunned executives. She walked all the way to the head of the table where Richard was standing. Richard looked at her. For a moment, a flicker of his old arrogance sparked. "Amelia, you can't just barge in here. This is a closed board meeting." "Actually," Tobias Finch said, stepping into the room behind her, carrying a leather portfolio. "As the majority shareholder of the parent entity project, Skyward LLC, Mrs. Sterling has called this meeting." Amelia stood next to Richard. She didn't say a word to him. She simply looked at the empty chair at the head of the table. His chair, and waited. The message was clear. Move. The tension in the room was excruciating. Richard's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He looked at the board silently, pleading for someone to intervene, to tell this waitress to get out of the boardroom. But the board members were sharks. They smelled blood, and they knew who held the bait. They remained silent. Slowly, painfully, Richard stepped aside. He walked to the side of the room and took a seat in a folding chair against the wall, usually reserved for junior assistants. Amelia sat down at the head of the table. She placed her hands on the mahogany. It felt cold, solid. It felt like justice. "Good afternoon," Amelia said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a quiet authority that Richard's shouting never had. "My name is Amelia Sterling. Most of you know me as Richard's wife. From this moment forward, you will know me as the chairwoman of the board." "Mrs. Sterling," Marcus Thorne said, his tone condescendingly polite. "With all due respect, running a household is very different from running a multinational aerospace defense contractor. We are in a crisis." "I know," Amelia replied coolly. "I've been reviewing the books for the last hour. You're over-leveraged in the Asian markets. Your R&D spending has bloated by 40% due to Richard's vanity projects, and you have a massive tax liability looming." Marcus blinked. Yes, that is accurate." "I didn't just run a household, Mr. Thorne," Amelia said, leaning forward. "I managed the cash flow of a business with zero margin for error, while my husband was dreaming. I know how to stretch a dollar, and right now Aerodyne is bleeding." She opened the portfolio Tobias had placed in front of her. "First order of business," Amelia announced. "We are halting the construction of the new headquarters in Dubai. It's a monument to ego, not a strategic asset. That saves us $300 million immediately." Richard gasped from his chair in the corner. "You can't." "We broke ground." "My name is on the building." "Not anymore," Amelia said, not even turning to look at him. "Second order of business. We are liquidating the corporate jet fleet. Executives can fly commercial. If it's good enough for our shareholders, it's good enough for you." A ripple of shock went through the room. The executives looked at each other in horror. No private jets. "And third," Amelia said, her eyes scanning the room, landing on each face. "We are initiating a full external audit of all executive expenses for the last 5 years. Any personal expenses charged to the company vacations, cars, jewelry." She paused, letting the word hang there. She knew Richard had bought Veronica a diamond necklace on the corporate card. She suspected the others were doing the same. "Will be repaid within 30 days, or you will be terminated for cause." The room was deathly quiet. The simple housewife had just walked in and gutted their culture of excess in 5 minutes. "Are there any objections?" Amelia asked. Marcus Thorne looked at Richard, huddled in the corner. Then he looked at Amelia, who held the power to dissolve the company and destroy his stock options. "No objections, Madam Chairwoman," Marcus said quietly. "Good," Amelia said. She stood up. "Meeting adjourned. Richard, stay behind." The executives filed out faster than school children at the bell. They didn't look at Richard as they left. They were too busy texting their assistants to hide their expense reports. When the door clicked shut, only Amelia, Tobias, and Richard remained. Richard stood up, his face twisted in anger. "You humiliated me in front of my own board. You cancelled the Dubai Tower. That was my legacy." "Your legacy," Amelia said, walking over to the window to look out at the city, "is a lie, Richard. You didn't build this. We did. And then you forgot the we." She turned to face him, the city skyline framing her silhouette. "I'm not firing you, Richard. You're going to keep your title. You're going to go on TV and smile and tell the world that Aerodyne is entering a new era of fiscal responsibility." "Why?" Richard spat. "Why keep me around if you hate me?" "Because," Amelia said, walking toward the door, "I want you to come into this building every single day. I want you to sit in that office and ask for my permission to spend a dime. I want you to remember every single day that you are only here because I allow it." She opened the door. "Go home, Richard. Oh, wait. You can't. The Hamptons house is in my name now. I suggest you find a hotel. Something affordable." Amelia walked out, Tobias following her. Richard Sterling stood alone in the sky deck. He looked out the window at the world he used to think he owned. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass and realized with a sinking heart that the waitress from the Bluebird diner had just served him the coldest dish of all. 1 year later, the cover of Forbes magazine didn't feature Richard Sterling. It featured a woman in a white suit, standing arms crossed with a faint, enigmatic smile. The headline read, "The Quiet Titan, How Amelia Sterling Saved Aerodyne from Itself." Under Amelia's leadership, the company hadn't just survived, it had thrived. The stock was up 30%. The bleeding from the vanity projects had stopped. The IRS settlement was heavy paid, mostly from Richard's liquidated personal assets, but the company was clean. On a rainy Tuesday in Seattle, Amelia sat in a familiar booth at the Bluebird diner. It was the only place she could think clearly. The vinyl seats were still cracked and the coffee still tasted like burnt hazelnuts. The bell above the door chimed. Richard walked in. He looked different. The Brioni suits were gone, replaced by off-the-rack business wear. He had grayed significantly at the temples. He didn't strut anymore. He walked with the caution of a man walking on thin ice. He slid into the booth opposite her. "Madame Chairwoman," he said, a habit he had developed in the office. It wasn't sarcastic anymore. It was fearful. "Hello, Richard," Amelia said, blowing on her coffee. "You're late for the quarterly review." "The traffic was bad," he muttered. "Taking the subway takes longer than the driver used to." "It's good for the environment," she replied calmly. "Here are the papers for the new drone initiative. Medical delivery for rural areas. No weapons, no surveillance. Just aid." Richard looked at the file. "The margins are thin, Amelia. The old board would never have approved this." "The old board isn't here," she reminded him. "And the public loves it. Our brand approval rating is the highest it's ever been." Richard signed the document. He didn't argue. He hadn't argued in months. He simply did as he was told. He was the CEO in name, but everyone knew he was just the pen in Amelia's hand. He put the pen down and looked around the diner. His eyes landed on the counter where they used to sit 20 years ago. "We were happy here," Richard said, suddenly, his voice thick with a sudden, unexpected emotion. "Do you remember when I had holes in my sweater? We were happy." Amelia looked at him. She didn't look away. "I was happy, Richard," she corrected him gently. "You were hungry. There is a difference." "I miss it," he whispered. "I miss us." "You don't miss us," Amelia said, signaling the waitress for the check. "You miss having someone who looked at you like you were a god. But you realized too late that gods don't need partners. Humans do." The waitress arrived with the bill. It was for 2 coffees and a side of toast. $6.50. Richard instinctively reached for his wallet, but he hesitated. He remembered the limits on his cards. He remembered the allowance she had approved for him. Amelia gently placed her hand over his, stopping him. It was the first time she had touched him in a year. "It's okay, Richard," she said, pulling out a black credit card, the corporate card. "I've got it. I always did." She stood up, buttoning her coat. "See you at the office," she said. Amelia walked out into the rain, the bell chiming behind her. She didn't look back. She had a company to run. Richard remained in the booth, staring at the empty seat, listening to the sound of the rain, realizing that the waitress he had underestimated had not only taken his empire, but she was the only one who had ever truly known what it cost. In the end, Richard Sterling lost more than just his billions. He lost the only person who loved him before the world knew his name. His story serves as a brutal reminder. Arrogance is a debt that eventually comes due, and the interest rates are devastating. Amelia proved that true power isn't about shouting the loudest or wearing the most expensive suit. It's about patience, resilience, and knowing your own worth, even when the person closest to you refuses to see it. She didn't just win a court case, she reclaimed her life. What a roller coaster of justice. I want to know what you think was Amelia's punishment for Richard. Too harsh, or did he get exactly what he deserved? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of karma and redemption, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.